One of the greatest gifts that God gave us, that we have the spoken word. And when we use our words, we're imitating him. Our words create worlds, like Tolkien's Middle-earth.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Okay.
Please put that in there.
All right. Well, welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. Jessica Abood, you will notice, is not here. She's absent today. There was a struggle for power. I prevailed. and so things will be just great today. All right. So we're going to talk today about writing, classical writing. What is the classical writing program? And we have Andrew Selby here with us, who is the son of Jim Selby, who wrote the Pro Gymnus Mata program, the classical composition program that Memoria Press publishes. And we'll be talking about that. But first, we'll ask the question we always ask at the beginning of this program, which is, what are you reading? Paul, you claim to have had something that...
Yeah, we just recorded an episode yesterday, but I had a new answer for today, which is Die with Zero. And I have no idea why I'm reading this book.
Where did you get it?
My library audio app just popped up and said, this book you reserved is ready for you. And I have no recollection of asking for this book. But I think one of my friends suggested it once, and I was like, oh, put it on a list, see when it's available. And so I'm learning that I should spend all my money before I die.
Oh.
That's what it's about. It's about it's like quantifying how much time it takes you to earn something and earn money. And then, like, if I'm going to go buy something, is it really worth that amount of time of my life? And then, like, do you really want to die with money in the bank, or do you want to spend all your money having life experiences before you die?
But what if you spend all your money and don't die?
Well, so actually, I was just listening to the section. He was like, that's what an annuity is for. And I was like, okay, this guy's got an answer for everything. I don't know that I believe him, but it is a fascinating, for everybody who grows up, save. It is an interesting counterpoint of the older you get, the less you're willing to go out and, like, the less energy you have to go out and do life experiences. And I'd never heard the terms that in retirement, you've got your go-go years, your slow-go years, and your no-go years. And so, like, after you retire, typically you got a few good go-go years, and then you've got some slow-go years, and then you've got no-go years, but you don't want to go do anything. And it's so they actually say that you think your expenses are going to go up. Your expenses don't actually go up. They stay the same. Because while your medical expenses go up, you don't spend money on anything else.
Right, because you're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Because I'm always having this conversation with my wife, who wants to save up as much money as possible to give it to the children and grandchildren. And I'm saying, no, I want to spend it all. But there is a factor of children.
Yes. Yes. And he addresses that. It's really interesting. It's a 5-hour book, and I don't think I'll swallow it, it's a hook, line, and sinker, but I think it is giving me something to think about.
But how does he deal with the children inheritance? Yeah, I have a student who's writing a senior thesis on why parents should make wills and trusts and that kind of thing. Well, so I'm eager to take a counter argument back to him. So help me out here.
His argument is that from the point of view of, like, this, he was like, first of all, if you're thinking about this when you're young, it is a decision to have kids. That is going to. You are going to have to earn more in order to provide for them. But he actually gave a fascinating example of an investment guy who ended up becoming worth $4 billion. But he said the fact is he can't spend it because he doesn't want to corrupt his kids and them getting used to everything being provided for them. And so that was a fascinating thing. But he basically says you should give the money to the kids before you die. So if you are, like, if it gives you joy to give your kids money or to give them experiences, that's what you ought to be doing while you're alive, rather than just dying and then they have this stuff, but they don't have you anymore.
Don't tell that to my wife.
Well, tell that to my mother.
Oh, yes, of course. All right. Well, thank you for that. And when I speculated at the beginning of the program that we might just can the discussion of books, because we had just done a show yesterday. Andrew pointed out that he had prepared something for this, so we couldn't just postpone that. So, Andrew, what are you reading?
Yeah. So I have long been frustrated by finding a really good version of the Robin Hood legends, King Arthur, that kind of thing. Like if you read Howard Pyle, I don't love the syntax and the complicated sentences and everything.
I
I'd like to
either.
read something a little bit, it just takes away from the charming legends that are Robin Hood and King Arthur. And then I stumbled on Roger Lancelin Green. And I don't know how I didn't know about this guy, because I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan,
Does
Tolkien
that mean
fan.
you're not using our curriculum?
Oh, now I am.
Andrew?
I was hoping he'd say that.
It was fun, because as I was diving more into what Memoria is offering, I found, look, there's Roger Lancelin Green,
That's right.
this author I just found. So I finished Adventures of Robin Hood recently, and now I'm on to the King Arthur legends. I'm reading with the kids a little bit at night. We have 5 kids, and it's great because it's simple enough that the 4.5-year-old can kind of understand it, but it's real King Arthur with, there's some killing, there's some exciting stuff in there. And the 16-year-old's drawn in with that, so it's a pretty great family book.
Well, and I'm a big Howard Pyle fan. I do like Howard Pyle, and I like that sort of almost antique kind of language that he
I really
uses.
don't.
But for a curriculum, it really is better to have something like Green, because it's a little more straightforward.
Well, especially if you're expecting the students to read it, which we are expecting the students to read it when they're younger.
Mm-hmm. Tanya, have you read anything between yesterday and today?
No. Well, I have read probably about 50 more pages in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
That is honestly impressive.
No, it's a children classic, so the book's this big. So the pages don't have, you turn the pages frequently. They don't have a lot on them.
Okay.
It's a small book.
I was trying to.
It's so fun to hold,
congratulate you,
though. And because it's just, it's embossed flowers, and it's an experience in itself just to hold the book.
How thick is this book?
It's about like this.
Okay. So
But it's
next
like
episode, you'll probably be done.
450.
Large type.
I doubt it. No, it's not large type, but I won't be finished next week. I'll have to talk about it again.
Well, I haven't read anything since yesterday to today, so I'll talk about it again on our next show.
Well, you've got a book right there. It looks like you've been reading.
Well, I've been reading. How to Think Like Shakespeare by Scott Newstock, and I'll be talking about this just a little bit, referring to it anyway in the context of writing, because he talks about the subject of our program today. So I thought I would throw that out there. All right, so we're going to start out by answering a question from a listener in Taiwan that was sent to our podcast at memoriapress.com. And he asks, he says, my children are still very young, 1 and 2, but I like to plan ahead and know where we are going. We live in Taiwan, and my children are half Taiwanese and half American. I plan to teach my children with your curriculum to give them a classical education from a Western perspective, but I also want my children to understand and appreciate their Chinese ancestry. My wife can teach Chinese reading and writing, and we've researched and discussed what Chinese literary classics, philosophies, and histories can be used for their education. Now, the problem: the Memoria Press curriculum is a full curriculum, and I don't want to overload it by adding to it without taking something away. I would appreciate any advice, thoughts, and recommendations in this area. I think this would be a good topic for discussion on the podcast. So what do we think of that? What do we say to somebody who's in another country with another culture, and then they're faced with having to do our program, which is a pretty full program, which is centered on Western civilization?
I think, first of all, kudos for even thinking, making sure that your children who are half Taiwanese understand their history and their culture. I think that's really important. It helps that they live in Taiwan, so their kids are going to get that culture just innately, a lot of it. We, I would say, we don't have this in our curriculum because how would we for 50 states? But typically in America, 4th grade is when you would do your state history. And so I don't know how people work that in or where they work it in. We actually don't do that anymore. We used to work it in. But then we decided it seemed so out of context with everything else we were teaching. So we started just including pieces of Kentucky history in other things that we taught. So it's not ideal probably, and it's not because we aren't really focused on it. But I think that's the only way, is to actually include, like when we teach European history, obviously, we are focusing quite a bit on what's happened in, how it affected America, all the history. And I think that's really, can you do that? I think you could do that. I wish we had more. I love that little short history, a short history of the world by Gombrich. I can't remember his, Gombrich, I think. It is great. And it does this doesn't answer that question at all. I am way off on a tangent. But I do think it's a great it's just a short little history of the world, and it covers everything, every continent, what was going on at particular times in just little bite-sized chunks. But I think that's what it has to be. If you're going to give a classical education, which is focused on Western civilization, you're going to have to then just make room for it, just like we make room for Greek.
What are they going to have to not do in order?
You're going to have to abbreviate some things. Like in kindergarten, first and second grade, we have our science and enrichment sets and our read alouds that we're doing, which is everything beyond the reading, writing, and arithmetic. And you absolutely can take some of you're going to want, because these kids are in Taiwan, you're going to want some of the American-driven things, because as Tanya said, their experience is going to be Taiwanese. And so you're going to want to keep some of the American ones, but you can cut some of those and bring in some Chinese language ones
that are part of their canon of literature.
Yeah, yeah. And then that would be one way to do it. In the primary years, I think in 3rd through 6, you may end up trying to condense Famous Men of Rome and Greece, maybe, where you might kick those both till 6th grade to make room in 4th grade in order to have a year where you're doing Taiwanese history, or you condense the nature study.
Well,
yes, and make it nature study where you're actually studying what they're seeing over there.
Yeah, where you're studying the
you're studying their trees.
Right.
Right.
I mean, we do some American history in our program.
Yes, and that's in 6th or 7th grades.
That may be a place to look too.
Yes, but they want their
he's trying
kids
to
to
hold
understand.
both
They want
intention.
both. But you could, I think you can do it. You just are going to have to be deliberate about it. Like you're going to have a plan.
Well, and you mentioned local history, because that's what I was thinking too, is even in America, when you're doing this program, you need to be like at least going out on field trips to local historical sites and learning about, we're in Kentucky, learning about Kentucky or wherever it is that you live, because there's a really interesting history to wherever you are in this country.
That's right.
And you really do need to do that. Or other countries, yeah.
But, it's well documented that also children learning more than one language as infants and toddlers, that it delays their speech. They start speaking later because they're parsing out multiple languages. And so I kind of take that as a launching pad to say you may not get as far at the age of the depth of content that insofar as, you'll get through Homer, you'll get through Virgil. Maybe you're not going to have time to dig in as deeply into City of God or metaphysics that we want, because you are bringing other things in. I do think that it is, in this case, it is a good thing to be bringing those other things in, but there's only so many hours in a day, and there's only so much content that child can assimilate.
That's right. You don't want your children to be in school more hours just because they're learning 2 cultures and 2 histories.
Yeah. So you're going to have to cut a little bit, but
and even for literature, you said K to 2 read alouds, but even literature. So 3rd grade, maybe Farmer Boy. I would definitely do Charlotte's Web, and maybe do then a good 3rd grade level book that is in their language. But just to make sure it's a classic book. It doesn't have to be our choices, but it does need to be.
Well, or not just a classic book, but you're talking about children here, and of course, in English, we have just a huge, vast treasury of children's literature that a lot of other cultures don't have, but there's always folklore and there's stuff there that you can use. And I don't know what that's like in China, but I assume that anybody in a Chinese culture like Taiwan would have some access to. I know they have children's books there too, but
right.
Folklore is actually a really good point because effectively, Farmer Boy is American folklore.
It is, yes.
Right. Andrew, do you have any views on this?
No, I think what you both said insofar as this question is just a really thoughtful one. And I think that the gentleman who wrote in demonstrates some good perception of like what his kids are going to need to, embrace who they are and figure out what their place in the world is. So yeah, I think your guys' suggestions are really helpful practically to achieve that goal.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's turn to classical composition and the work of Andrew, your father. We were talking at lunch today about how we got to know him and how he knew Cheryl Lowe, our founder, and sort of what led up to our adoption of this program. Of course, you were very close to him because you were his son. What started him out on this? Why did he even come up with a program like this?
Yeah, so my dad got into classical education as kind of a second career in his early 40s, I think it was, and started a school in the Portland, Oregon area where I grew up. And in that school, they were teaching writing to fourth graders. And I believe my mom was the teacher, and they were trying to get them to write some kind of paragraph or something. And there were tears. There were multiple children who were crying because it was so frustrating. And my dad just realized, like, this can't go on. Like, there's got to be a way to teach writing that's not traumatic, that actually makes sense, that the kids can get their minds around, that teachers can explain. There's got to be something. So because he was already thinking classically, he had been into great books for years and years. He studied with Francis Schaeffer one summer when he was younger, and had a really good literature professor in college. That he had an instinct to go to the tradition and see what in the Western tradition there could be to answer this question and how to help these kids so that they could learn how to write without crying about it, without feeling the weight on them. So then he came across the progymnosmata. If you run the real official Greek pronunciation, it's the progymnosmata, but we all say progymnosmata at this point. It's just a little easier, or even progym if you want.
I was going to say usually something shorter.
Yeah, there you go. And what he found out is that there was a certain way that writing was taught, starting with, really it began to take shape in Golden Age Athens, really reached a more sophisticated form in Quintilian in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD, and then a few centuries after that was developed by some Greek authors, most notably Aphthonius of Antioch. And this guy put together a progymnosmata curriculum that ended up being used for centuries after that in the Byzantine Empire, which never fell when the Western Roman Empire fell. So school children learning Greek would learn that for centuries to come. And then in the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of the progymnosmata, and authors like Shakespeare and Milton, they were all educated with the progymnosmata and in a Latin translation. And it actually kept going until around the 18th century before, for various reasons, it went out of favor. So my dad thought, well, you've got basically 2,000 years of this kind of curriculum that worked for 2,000 years. I don't want to mess around like experimenting with this or that. Let's use something that we know works. And so he found a good translation of it and started writing lessons. And it was the kind of thing where he was like writing the lesson the night before it was going to be taught, and then back to the drawing board the next night and figuring out how to teach it better. And then that ended up coalescing around a curriculum, and it's had great success in the schools that have adopted it. So since then.
Well, writing is very intimidating for a lot of people. I mean, it's kind of my living, to do it now, but I practiced a lot. And I think one of the things about your dad's program, and I'm going to ask you kind of how it's structured here in a minute, is that it gives you a system, because writing today is taught very haphazardly. We talked about the 5-paragraph essay, which is sort of the standard thing. But in a lot of cases, it's just be creative, and they put a piece of paper in front of you, and you're supposed to write something on it. And that doesn't work very well. And in fact, I may have said this on the show before, the way I learned how to write was through practice, doing just again and again and again. But I didn't have a format, but I sort of did, and it's kind of part of what your dad's program does, where imitation, emulating ways in which other people write. Because I was on a college newspaper. We were a daily paper. We were the community's paper. We had 20,000 circulation. And I was an editorials editor. And we had those, like in the old days, I hate to say that now, the old newspapers had those two, they usually like 2 or 3 editorials on the left-hand side of the editorial page, right? And so I was one of the people who wrote those. So we had 2 editors. So the other editor would sit on his terminal and write his editorial starting 8 or 9 in the morning. And then I would write the other one. And then we would switch chairs and edit, and it had to be in by 4 p.m. And I've said before, writing on deadline is a really great way to learn how to write. You have to be done at this time and do it every day, But this and what I did, I realized later on, is there were certain writers I really liked, and I would directly imitate them. And I still have the bound volumes of that newspaper in my garage, and I got them out just a couple months ago because we were moving, and I looked at the the editorials I had written, and it was shameless imitation of some of these people. But that's how you learn. You learn by imitating good things, and you learn by practice, and that's part of what this program does. How is this program structured? Yeah.
So what you said about imitation and repetition, that's exactly it. So the program is really structured around that, and it meets the kids where they are too. So you begin by storytelling, but not like just, go write a story, here's a blank piece of paper. Rather, you have a fable, and the first stage is called the fable stage, where you take a fable by Aesop and you rewrite it in different ways. So you don't just copy it word for word, but instead the students learn how to, from an outline, they learn how to reproduce the fable in their own words and add in various figures of description. So they use descriptive language to enhance the fable, to bring out some aspect of it.
So that way, they're not having to think up the story. That's a whole nother
that's right.
thing. They're just taking a story that already is there, and they're retelling it in their own way so they can focus on the writing itself.
That's right, yeah. And they just get used to writing that way too, because like you said, writing can be a very intimidating task. I mean, it's one of the greatest gifts that God gave us, that we have the spoken word. And when we use our words, we're imitating him. Our words create worlds, like Tolkien's Middle Earth. And our words can persuade people towards either things that are bad or things that are good. And it's one of the greatest acts of love to persuade somebody towards what's good. So it's, even though writing is very complex, it's well worth it. It's something that brings great joy when we master it. So classical composition the program seeks to do that. The Progymnosmata seeks to do that. And you start with, that imitation of different stories. And the first 2 stages are like that, the fable and the narrative. And then in the 3rd and 4th stage, the Crea and the Maxim stages, you start with just an idea. All right, so you don't have to generate the idea yet. There's a wonderful idea, usually in some kind of proverbial form, where in a very short, few amount of words, you get a deep idea. And then your job is to expand that, explain it, and prove it. And one of the steps for that is coming up with a story that demonstrates the truth of the saying, and then the other one that shows like what all the bad consequences that can happen when you don't follow the truth of the saying. Like if it was like, it's best to prepare for the days of necessity. You could tell a story about a farmer who carefully cut the hay and made sure that his livestock had something to eat through the wintertime. And then you could tell a story about a farmer who was lazy and didn't do that. And then, the way that his animals would suffer and his farm would suffer because of that. So the Crayon maxim get you used to explaining. Right? Well, students still haven't learned how to argue. And then in the refutation and confirmation, they learn how to actually make an argument against, usually it's a story. So they have some kind of story, like a fairy tale or something along those lines. And they argue, this actually doesn't make sense. This isn't a good story that's worth telling. And they have different ways of generating ideas or generating arguments against that story. And then you turn around, and this is one of the most fun things to teach, because you turn around after the students have done that and you say, okay, now you have to confirm the story. You have to write from the other side and say, no, this is a worthy story that we should listen to. And you learn how to argue both sides of an issue, which, of course, we want students who can see both sides of an issue, who can see why it is that somebody else disagrees with them and actually meet their arguments where they're at instead of just talking past them, as we see so often happen in our popular culture. So those exercises are just awesome for that kind of thing.
So you're setting what we would call invention aside in a lot of these things and just using what's you're given and working on it.
At first. But even in with refutation and confirmation, that's where you're beginning to do that classical process of invention, which means to discover, to find an idea.
In Crayon maxim, because they've got to come up with stories of their own to illustrate the truth of the saying that they're working on.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, the invention is phased in very gradually,
right?
So if we start classical composition in 4th grade, Crayon maxim is done in 6th, refutation confirmations in 7th. So you're really not asking them to start inventing until middle school, and that's, I think, a key component of it.
And that hits them right where their development is typically. Mm-hmm. Students like to argue at that point because they have this new power that they can use logic so well. So that's one of the things that the curriculum does too, is it kind of works with the grain of their development and phases things in gradual ways. Because I think a lot of us have had an experience where, maybe it was a college class or an upper level high school class where a professor we really respected said, all right, give me a 4-page essay on this or that. And you're like, what? How do I even start? But students who have gone through our program have tools to address those kinds of prompts.
Mm-hmm. I hate to use the word technique because it's such a modern sounding term, but that's kind of what you're giving them, right? You're giving them you're teaching them a way to write. Because writing, and I don't hear people say this much, but it's a craft.
Right.
Well, isn't that technique? Isn't that what that means?
Well, I think it does. It just, that's what I'm saying. It sounds modern, but it's really, that's what it is.
Techne.
A techne, which is an ancient term.
Yeah.
And you have to do a technique or a craft. You do it better by just doing it over and over and over again.
And breaking down the skills too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I played basketball growing up and, I was really short until I got a little older. And so I had to figure out ways to compensate for my shortness and kind of slowness. And so I learned, okay, if I could dribble really well, then I could be a better player and make the team, or if I could pass really well or shoot really well. Well, then you start learning about passing and shooting and dribbling, and there's specific drills that you can do to build your abilities in each of those areas, right? So at first it's just basketball, but then you break it down into shooting, dribbling, passing, and then there's drills that you can do in each of those to enhance your ability like that. Well, writing's actually the same thing. There's, the big game of writing. That could be anything. It could be it could be a eulogy for a loved one. It could be a best man speech. It could be that you need to advocate for a political position that you believe in. And there's all sorts of, there could be trying to convince a girl that she should marry you. There's all sorts of events of speaking and writing, but they can be broken down into specific skills, and then we can work on those. And that's the genius of the Pro Gym. And I think once my dad saw that, he was like, "Oh, this is what we have to do this."
Yeah, right. Sports is a really good analogy for this, because that's another kind of you're learning a series of techniques. Mm-hmm. I had boys, and so they were.
Here we go again. You also had a girl.
Very involved. Yeah, but she didn't like sports. But they
she
were
did.
involved
She did too, like a sport. Horseback riding.
Oh, well, I don't. That's not.
Listen, this is the second time today he said I had 3 sons, and
Anne's not listening.
I had 3 sons who were very involved in sports, and that you see that at least on when they're getting good training for it, because a lot of sports, if you go to the rec league, they just want to get you out there and play, and they're not really doing all those things that when you get into select leagues and all that for something like soccer, they're gonna start breaking it down. The better the training, the more they're going to break things down, at least at first,
right?
So that when they get out on the field, they're using those things automatically and habitually.
Yeah,
and that is a very helpful aspect of writing if you can learn these techniques in a habitual way, because you have enough to think about already when you're writing, and you need not to have to think about a few things. And so I think that's kind of what your dad's program did.
Also, I feel like what it does, another thing that it does is it helps students with the content of their writing. It gives them their creative writing that we talked about. I mean, creative writing's great if there are a lot of gifted authors out there. But for most students, if you give them these tools, then they are able to work within the context of those. And so you've given them the guidance that they need to actually write something that's worth reading. That's not just throwing things on a page.
It's like bowling, right? Like with a kid, you put the bumpers out, because otherwise the ball's always going to go in the gutter, right? And by restricting the content of what they're writing, we've put those bumpers, put those guidelines out.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things I like to point out for people that are like, wow, this feels like so different from anything that,
your typical writing
program. And is this really going to prepare my student for what they need? When I grew up, I was taught that there were 4 kinds of writing, which, I mean, this is sort of the modern idea, right? You got expository writing, narrative writing, descriptive, and persuasive. And you can kind of go through the program and see, right, the first 2 levels, fable and narrative. I mean, it's narrative writing. That's what it is, right? The Crea Maxim's expository writing. We're taking some idea and we're trying to elucidate what that means. Now we have a lot of tools to do that I didn't get in my modern writing course. Persuasion, I mean, the whole program's persuasion, but particularly in refutation, confirmation, common topic, they get that in spades. And then, I mean, there's whole stages afterwards, which are all working on sort of this ability to describe. Can you make something come alive?
Yeah.
Can you make it feel real? And so, I'd like to point out to parents, like, if you're worried about them getting all of this, they're going to get all of those skills.
Yeah.
We call them different things. We break them down into very specific parts. But if, instead of just telling the student, this is what expository writing is, okay, now go write an expository paper, we're actually saying, here, we're going to give you a proverb. We're going to walk you through 9 steps to elucidate that, and you're going to end up with an expository paper.
Yeah, and so you're speaking about different ways that we write in the modern world, and the way that the program gets into it. So I teach history at Trinity Classical Academy, and in Santa Clarita, California, and in the medieval history class that I teach, I have them do a research paper at the end of the year. Well, I use the heads of the encomium to help them with that, and they just learned that the year before. And so they're able to bring that into their history paper. And it turns out that, if you want to write a comprehensive research paper about somebody, you're going to write about their birth source or origin. You're going to write about their education. You're going to write about their achievements. And then you're going to compare them to somebody else to give a little perspective. That's just how a good history paper goes. And that's exactly how the program teaches them how to write that. And another activity I have them do in the history class is write a characterization essay. The characterization is the 12th out of the 14 stages. So unfortunately, a lot of people stop before it, and that breaks my heart, because that's a wonderful stage where you write as in character and as a certain person, giving a soliloquy, usually at some dramatic point in a person's life. So the example curriculum is what Niobe says, right after Athena kills all 12 of her kids, and what does she say in that moment? Because of her pride, she had been prideful towards Athena, and it's this heartrending essay about that from Niobe's perspective. Well, in my history class, I'll give them an example what would St. Francis say the day that he gave his clothes back to his dad and said, I'm going to live for my Father in heaven from now on in poverty, and what would his emotions be right after that? And so it causes them to inhabit that historical character, think about that moment in time, and really embed themselves in that history, and then also get to be creative with it, because we don't know exactly what St. Francis thought. So wouldn't it be fun to put words in his mouth? And
yes, like Wolf Hall, where Hilary Mantel puts words in Cromwell's mouth. Called it like Wolf Hall.
Yeah, I don't like Wolf Hall.
No, I think there's a reason why. There's some pretty insidious stuff in that story.
Hey,
I'm with you.
yeah,
but it's also super entertaining.
Paul was not entertaining.
I put it down after 200 pages, but I do think that exercise, and because I've seen this in students, and because I had teachers ask me, so it's all the whole program, whole classical composition program is all. It starts off very much just retell the original story, and they're like, well, how much leeway do they have? Because you have some students that really want to be creative, even in the fable and narrative stages, and I mean, my response to that has been like, look, as long as they keep the recognition, reversal, and suffering, right, the three parts of the fable, so they have the moral of it, let them play with who did it, let them play with where it happened, and they start using the creativity, but it's still within a framework, and you're letting the students do it who want to do it. Right. So as they're being able to do it, Tanya, you don't look like you love this.
I don't, because they always choose aliens, and I just don't. I just think, I don't know.
Are you talking about your son here, or are you talking about other children?
Yes, my son did that.
I know he
sure did.
It's my class.
Okay, so maybe it's personal for me.
I dug out my copy of How to Think Like Shakespeare by Scott Newstock, who's going to be speaking at our summer conference here this summer. And he has a whole chapter on the pro-gym. Nasmata. Whatever.
Nasmata. I was corrected on that recently.
And I said that earlier. But he says here, I was curious as to his description of the pro-gymnosmata. He said it provides students the infrastructure to help them write. And I thought, I like that word in connection with this. The infrastructure, what Winston Churchill termed the scaffolding of rhetoric. And I really like that term, scaffolding, and I like to apply it to education, because most education is scaffolding. And part of the problem we have all the time in writing and in other subjects in our schools is we want to head straight for the result. Right. And we don't want to do the things in between that we really need to do this. And it's like, I've always described it, it's like building a house. Instead of building the scaffolding first and then using that to build the house, you just start with the roof first. A lot of modern education is just starting with the roof first, and it doesn't work out very well. Or
even if you just start from the ground up, like your house is going to be pretty small.
Yeah.
Pretty ineffective, but you can build a cathedral with scaffolding.
Yeah.
But it is also frustrating with the onlookers. It's the onlookers of that building that see somebody go in and they're putting up scaffolding, and they're putting up scaffolding for months, right? And you're like, can you all not get something done? But in writing, it's the same thing. Like, you're like, really, that's all my fourth grader can do? Yeah, that is all your fourth grader can do right now. Mm-hmm. But if you follow it, if you build that scaffolding year after year, at some point you will reach the height of that cathedral.
And it's so much easier for us now, looking back on this history and knowing that it really does work. Like, we can trust, if it can produce somebody like Shakespeare, if it can produce somebody like St. Augustine or Ambrose of Milan.
The other thing too is when you read your favorite author or whatever, you look at what they wrote and you say, that's so beautiful, and you think you can just do that. Well, no, you can't. You do need a lot of practice. He says in here, the end of all these exercises was fluent performance, but it takes a great deal of experience to become natural.
Yes.
And he cites Willa Cather as an example of this. Really? I didn't know that, but I was thinking of Bing Crosby, because I saw some interview somewhere, and he was talking about how that easy sounding voice he's got, this beautiful voice, how he had to practice and practice and practice to get that. You can't just do that immediately. There's a lot of practice hidden under that really great style.
Yeah, or take it back to basketball. You watch somebody like Steph Curry dribble, and he looks just like he was born with a basketball in his hand, and it just came to him. But it's the same thing. Like, he did all these crazy drills, and then when he's on the court, it's just like poetry in motion.
Yeah, which is where I think that whole thing of craft does come in. He says they practice language. They should practice language in the same way a lawyer practices law or a doctor practices medicine all the time as a part of their active identity, and practice.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a lot of the frustration with a writing program like ours, is that people don't write. You don't think about write. You think math, build the foundation, just do drill after drill after drill. Science, not science. Latin, same thing. English grammar, same thing. But you think writing is more like literature class or history class, where the material gets more difficult, but it's the same skills all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think writing really, with this program, is really more like Latin or math, where you literally are learning step by step by step, practicing, and then everything is building. But it's frustrating because people don't expect that writing should be like that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we need to start changing our vocabulary. You said doctors practice medicine and lawyers practice law. Maybe it needs to be, I practice writing, not I'm an author.
I like that a lot, actually. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's a hard attitude to instill in people.
Yeah,
that they have to do this.
Yeah, a lot of teachers can get sidetracked with certain elements of the curriculum, and get hung up on the Greek terms for the figures of description that we have in there, or they could get hung up on outlining or things like that. And that's not, it's kind of hard sometimes to see the forest through the trees, and you don't want to just stop with one of those things. But yeah, you want that practice. You want them putting the pencil to the paper frequently, because then they become the author one day.
Yeah. Okay, well, and they can find out more about the progymnosmata, even possibly how to pronounce it, on our website under classical composition. And there are several articles up there. There's a nice little chart I noticed too. So if you're interested in classical composition, you can visit our website at www.memoriapress.com. And
there's 3 W's, but we'll just keep going.
You don't put just 2 W's in there, because no telling what you'll find.
You don't even have to put the www. Just memoriapress.com will get you there.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for your contribution.
Well, I'm IT, all things IT.
All right. Yeah, so it's on our website, and we thank you for being with us today, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode, or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.